Welcome everyone to the Football Odyssey podcast. This is Aaron Harris, and today's episode will be an interview with Shane Richmond. Shane is the founder of Pigskin Books, a website where football fans can discover a wide variety of vintage and contemporary football books about a multitude of topics ranging from the history of specific teams, playing strategies, the business of pro football, and much more. Shane and I discuss his roots as an American football fan growing up in the United Kingdom, the background behind Pigskin Books, and some of our favorite football reads. I posted a link to Shane's website in the description, so after the podcast, check it out and get some great recommendations for your own football library. If you enjoyed this interview as much as I did, then please subscribe and share. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at The Football Odyssey, and reach out to me in the contact section of thefootballodyssey.com. And, as always, thank you for listening. I started reading Pigskin Books probably about a year and a half ago, and I've gotten some great recommendations. And I think it's great that we have a website that's dedicated to giving reviews to football books, especially vintage football books. So can you start by telling the audience how and when you were first introduced to the game of football?
Sure. So as somebody who grew up in the UK, I got interested in the NFL in the mid-1980s. And it's common. I'm in my mid-40s now, and it's pretty common for people of my age to have got into the sport then. Americans find it kind of weird, but in the early 80s in the UK, we had 3 TV channels. And in about 1982, we got our 4th TV channel called Channel 4. And their remit was to provide an alternative to what was available on the other channels, and that included with sport. So they started showing the NFL. And when I was about 10 or 11 on a Sunday evening, we had 2 channels showing religious programming, 1 channel that would be showing some very grown-up, serious documentary. And then on Channel 4, you had the NFL, which was this incredibly colorful and exciting sport that I'd never seen anything like it before, basically. So it was the 85 season when I got into watching the game, and the year the Chicago Bears won the Super Bowl, which gave me a love of defensive football, which I still really enjoy to this day. And I kind of followed it from there on, really. So we started with this weird being, we would get the NFL on a Sunday night, but we were actually seeing the highlights of the previous week's games. So we were constantly a week behind what was happening in the US, which meant that once you started following the sport and you wanted to see who had won that week, it was actually very difficult to keep up to date. So you either had to listen to the Armed Forces Radio Network, which was broadcast for US service personnel here in Europe, or you had to wait until Tuesday when the newspapers would carry the results of the games. So it was kind of a weird process at first, and certainly a long way from where we are today, where you can see everything live as it happens.
Now, were the highlights that you were watching, were they produced by NFL Films, or was it kind of the networks that cut together a package and that's what you saw?
It was stuff that they got from the networks, and the Channel 4 would then edit it themselves. So they would take the game footage and edit that down, either the same kind of stuff that you guys would see in halftime on Monday Night Football or something, or slightly extended highlights. So usually we'd get 1 or 2 games where they'd show you more extended highlights of what was happening. And then eventually they moved on to showing a little bit of a live game. But because of the time it was on, they would show you a live game and then stop before it would finish. So it's just, that's all we've got time for now. So that game's still in progress, and you'll find out next week how it turned out. It was a very sort of ramshackle way of doing things at first.
And when you started watching, was this something that your friends had also taken to, or did you find other fans in the UK at the same time, or was this something that for a while was really unique to you?
It was something that quite a lot of kids of my age were getting into. So I found fairly early on that there were other kids at school who were also interested in watching the game and had been watching it too. And it was still a pretty small group of us. I'd say there were sort of half a dozen kids in my school year who were all into the NFL, and it was very different from how it is now, where since they've been playing the games in London, a younger generation has got into the sport here, and they're very open to a new and exciting sport. The UK, I think, was much more insular in the 80s. So the kids who were really into soccer were very dismissive of the NFL. And it was just seen as kind of, well, it's like rugby, but they wear all these pads for some reason because they don't like taking the hits, or well, what's wrong with these people? So you kind of, it was a very sort of oppositional thing. If you were into the NFL here in the UK in the 80s, you would find a lot of people who were very anti-NFL, this new sport that had kind of shown up.
And what was it about the game that drew you to it? I know you mentioned that's when you grew to have a passion for defensive football, but everybody has a different attraction to the game. Some people it's the physical nature, some people it's more cerebral. What was it for you that really drew you to the game of football, and maybe some other friends in your circle that were interested as well?
I think the thing that really clinched it for me was the realization that there are kind of two games going on at the same time. There's the physical confrontation on the field, where you have these elite athletes who are doing incredible things that most human beings can't do. But you also have this strategic aspect on top of it, with these two coaches trying to outwit one another. And it was that really grabbed my imagination, I think. The fact that it's, growing up here with soccer, which is a much more free-flowing game, and obviously there is strategy and tactics involved, but it things kind of ebb and flow, and you don't have that opportunity to kind of pause and think about how to change your tactical approach. It was that bit that really captured my imagination, I think. The fact that you were sitting there and going, okay, well, what have we just done and what worked, and how can we try and exploit what we can see the other guys trying to do? So that was the fascinating thing, I think. And then the other thing that grabbed me and my friends generally was simply the newness of it. It's at that age when you're sort of 11 or 12 and something new comes along that's different to what you've seen before. You kind of want to learn about it, I think. But yeah, the strategy has always been the thing that's grabbed me.
Yeah, and it seems the stop and go nature of the sport is something that can either really interest people or can really dispersuade people from getting into the sport. Because I've known a few people who were big soccer players growing up, and they just can't get into football because they don't like how it's stop and go. They like something that's more free flowing. Whereas with other people, they take it to it more kindly, and they kind of enjoy that cerebral element to the point where everything is really structured within the sport, and it's not as free flowing as soccer or basketball or lacrosse.
Yeah, that's right. And I know today, when you talk to people today, they're much more open to the idea of a new and different sport. And so talk to about it who are not necessarily NFL fans will often say, yeah, I'm interested, but it just seems too slow because there's this stopping and starting. And I find that once people understand what's going on in that process, then the gaps for a start begin to seem kind of smaller because you're thinking along the same lines as everybody else is thinking. You're thinking who's coming into the game, who's going out, what are they going to try and do this time? But also you have that sense of understanding the rhythm a little bit better, which is with any new sport, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on. And soccer, and I'm a soccer fan as well, but soccer has the problem of long periods where nothing much seems to be happening, and that can be something for fans who are used to sports where there's more constant action. They can find that quite hard to deal with. And the same thing applies there, that once you understand what's going on, it becomes more absorbing because you start to see patterns and things that a novice to the game wouldn't see necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you learn the game just from watching it on television, or did you have programs in the UK that kind of broke down the way the game was played, or did you have magazines that kind of did that as well?
So the TV shows would kind of explain the basics. So that was the first objective to get over, was just understanding the down system and the general principles of how you move the ball and the different ways of scoring. But there were books that came out annually. So there was sort of NFL annual that was published here in the UK that I know lots of people my age would get every Christmas, and that would kind of give you some basics of what was going on in the game, and also round up the previous year, and tell you a little bit about some of the stars from previous generations and so on. So you'd fill in a little bit of the history. But media-wise, we were quite well served, actually. I think at one point we had 3 or 4 monthly magazines that came out here, and a weekly magazine as well called First Down, which would come out on a Thursday. So you would, to read the game reports from the Sunday, you would have to wait until Thursday's First Down arrived. That's when you would know what had happened and who'd won and who'd lost and so on. So it was a process of gradually learning through that. And then because I was so interested in all of the little details, I started getting the record and fact book every year as well, which had the rules in the back of it and all the various little strange things around, how fumbles on punts are handled or whatever. So the obscure rules that would never be explained in a TV broadcast. But it was a slow process of accumulating knowledge kind of year on year, I think.
Yeah, and the fact and records book is one way to really impress people with how much you know. Because if you can really define the rules, which is so hard for people to understand if you're not passionate about the game, I mean, that will really give you the nuts and bolts of every single situation in football.
It's true, and it was helpful to have that. And also, I managed to, I impressed my geography teacher once by knowing the word impetus in a lesson, which came purely from having read the NFL record and fact book, which was explaining how you determine where, I think it was where a tackle has stopped. It's when the forward impetus has ceased. So I was like, that's an interesting new word. So it came in handy for that as well.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, stuff like that, you never know where it can come in handy in other areas of life, right?
It's true. It's true.
Now, how do you describe the current culture of American football in the UK? Is it still viewed by and large as a novelty, or are people starting to really gain more interest in the sport itself and the business and everything that goes on in the NFL, or do you think it's somewhere in between?
It's worlds away from where it was when I was a kid. So the huge thing that changed was when we started getting the international series games being played here. So when actual competitive games, because we had, in the 80s we had exhibition games played here. So the American Bowl, I went and saw Dan Marino's Dolphins take on Joe Montana's 49ers in London, which was great, but it was an exhibition game, and so you knew it didn't really matter. And the big stars only played for a quarter. But from 2007, when they actually brought over teams for competitive games, it started to be a much bigger deal. So the BBC started showing those games as well. Mostly the NFL here is on Sky Sports, which is a satellite or cable channel, and it's pretty widely subscribed to because they have the Premier League as well. So a lot of people have it, but it's not in every household by any means. The BBC obviously is, everyone has BBC TV. So when they started showing the games, it then attracts the attention of lots of people who are otherwise not going to go and seek it out. So I think the classic example is Illuminor, whose first name I can't remember, but was drafted by the Ravens a few years ago on the offensive line, and he grew up here in Britain. His first exposure to the NFL was watching the 2007 game between the Dolphins and the Giants, and he persuaded his dad to let him go to college in the States because he wanted to play that sport, and ended up being drafted by the Ravens and then moving on to the Patriots. I don't know if he's still in the league, but he's a British guy who ended up playing in the NFL purely because he saw one of the London games on TV. And I think that shows just how far we've come since the 80s. And you can now, most people who are into sport will now have an awareness of the NFL, even if it's not a sport that they personally like or follow. They will be able to talk about it. Whereas back in the 80s, it was very, very niche. So it's grown massively. It's still a minority thing, but it's grown massively from where it was.
And when you were growing up, who were some of the players that were really popular in the UK?
So Dan Marino was massively popular. And actually, when they came over for the American Bowl, Dan Marino was on one of the live nighttime chat shows, kind of like the Tonight Show or whatever equivalent here. So I remember him being on television and the host asking him whether practicing for an NFL game entailed just putting the pads and the helmet on and running into a wall. That was the level of understanding of how the game worked. But he came over and he was a big star. William Perry, the refrigerator, was a huge star, captured loads of people's imaginations. That Chicago Bears team in general, I think, in the same way that they captured the imaginations of people in the States, they had that personality that made them appealing over here. The 49ers obviously were really successful throughout that era. So Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, those guys were stars here too. Essentially, I think for a while there were lots of Dolphins fans here, lots of Cowboys fans here, and then basically whoever had won the most recent Super Bowl had an absolute ton of fans. So people who were getting on board with it would follow the most recent Super Bowl team. So there are still lots of Bears fans here in the UK who became fans of the team through that Chicago Bears team in '85, and the same with fans of the. There's lots of fans of the Washington football team, as we must now call them. But you even have, I mean, the Bengals, for example, have a huge following over here, and it's largely down to that period in the 80s where they made a couple of Super Bowls and they were a pretty strong team. Same with the Browns. You know, the Browns in the 80s had a run of a couple of championship games, almost making it to a Super Bowl, picked up quite a lot of fans over here who are still followers of the team, but obviously not a lot of success has come their way since.
Yeah, I imagine, at least for Cincinnati, that there's probably more fans in the UK than there are here.
Yes, it's certainly possible. I mean, they have a phenomenal fan base over here. I mean, their fan base on Twitter is really big. They have a weekly podcast, and they've had the head coach on and big players on and stuff. I mean, it's like they genuinely have a really great community here, and particularly when you consider the fact that, you know, they haven't. When did they last make the playoffs? 25 years ago, something like that. I mean, you know, they haven't had a lot to celebrate, and those guys are still following the team week in, week out, which is pretty impressive.
What about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Are they a popular team over there? Because I remember watching, I think it was an NFL Network or ESPN short documentary about the Tampa Bay Bucks following in the UK, and they had this was before podcasts were really popular, but they had like a weekly magazine or a newsletter they would send out. They had a massive fan club, so I was always wondering if that was a team that was really popular and why it was that way.
They have a fan base, but all of the teams have a fan base at this point. I know that the Buccaneers fan base has been around since the 80s, and they did, because Florida is a popular holiday destination for people here in the UK. Right. The Florida teams have had a bit of a following, so people would go out there, and they've had this relationship. I think they have quite a good relationship with the team, actually, that they've built up over quite a long time. Obviously, the fact that it's owned by the Glazer family, who also own Manchester United here, so there's kind of a link. But actually, Manchester United fans really dislike the Glazers, so that hasn't helped to endear them to UK fans. But no, they're not. I mean, there is a fan base, but they're not especially notable. I would say the big ones, the Patriots, for obvious reasons, that's built up over the last few years. The Bengals, really big. The Packers have a huge fan base in the UK and Ireland. And the Jags get a lot of attention because they effectively have an official arm over here. You know, the UK Jags Twitter account is an official account. They're the only one. So they've been able to draw that attention. And again, as with Tampa Bay and the Glazers, they're owned by a guy who also owns one of the big soccer teams here. So that brings that connection in.
Now, have you been to any of the international games since 2007?
I've been to all of them except one.
Wow.
So there was one, and it's the only one I haven't been to. I feel kind of annoyed that I didn't go to it, but it was the 49ers against the who were they playing? Oh, was it 49ers Patriots? I think it was 49ers Patriots, and I might be misremembering. It was the Patriots playing somebody, and it was going to be absolutely one-sided. The Patriots winning easily.
Was it the Rams?
It could have been, yeah, it might have been that one, yeah. And so it was one that I looked at and thought, I don't need to see that. It's going to be a very boring, easy win. So I've been to all of them except that one, whichever one that was.
And what's the atmosphere like? Because personally, I love watching it because that means we get football at about 9 o'clock in the morning over here.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I watch the games, you see everybody that has a different jersey, and everybody comes, and I see a lot of people get really excited into the game, and some other people I think may not be totally certain what's going on, but they look like they're having a grand old time. So can you kind of describe the atmosphere of what it's like to go to one of those games?
Sure. I mean, it's nowhere near the atmosphere of an NFL game in the States. So it's not as intense. It starts off pretty noisy because everyone's there and excited. If the game is a competitive one, then the atmosphere will kind of keep going longer. We've had a few where, one team is clearly in the lead at halftime and then it goes quite flat. Other than that, it's very dependent on the fan bases of the teams who are playing. So when the Bills played here, for example, the Bills fans were amazing. They made loads of noise and kept the atmosphere going throughout. Same with the Chiefs and the Seahawks. Those were the other fan bases that really stand out as being noisy and excited throughout. And obviously, all three fan bases have a reputation in the States as being pretty hardcore. So I think a lot of fans had come over for those games and kept the atmosphere going, and that in turn fed into the excitement of the UK fans. But otherwise, what tends to happen is because, as you say, everyone there is really there representing their team, so most people don't have a particular stake in the outcome of the game, and so the atmosphere tends to go a bit flat later on, which is not what happens when you get to an NFL game in the States. I mean, that said, I've been to games in Jacksonville that haven't had a huge amount of atmosphere either. So, Wembley's fairly competitive.
So you just mentioned that you've been to games in Jacksonville. Have you been to any other games in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I'm a Ravens fan, and I've been to a whole bunch of games in Baltimore. In 2013, I came out and went to five in a row. So I did 4 in Baltimore and then flew to Chicago, met up with a friend there who was a Bears fan, and we went to watch the Bears game. So I've been to Washington, I've been to Baltimore, I've been to Jacksonville because my wife's grandparents live near there, and I've been to Chicago. So four NFL cities.
What game stands out the most to you?
I think definitely that 2013 Thanksgiving game. I went to Thanksgiving night, Steelers versus Ravens, and it was, I mean, obviously it's a huge rivalry anyway, so the atmosphere was incredible. But that was also the night where during a Jacoby Jones kick return, Mike Tomlin stepped on the field, which is obviously memorably weird, but that set off just a huge atmosphere in the stadium. The replay guys spotted that and just kept showing it throughout the rest of the game, which just sparked off the crowd, so that was great. The one in Chicago, we got hit by a passing hurricane, so the tornado, sorry. So that was memorable, but mainly because we got absolutely drenched.
I'm actually a Steeler fan, so I remember that game very well because
Okay.
everybody had a good time with the memes afterwards and making it look like a dance move and everything like that.
Funny,
But that was a strange chapter, and that's a rivalry too. That's always great because I was actually rewatching the Christmas game from I think it was 2016 with the Immaculate Extension. And the commentators start off right before the kickoff saying, these teams only had 2 wins each. It would still have this kind of atmosphere. And it's true because, when you look at the history, I mean, a lot of the history between the two teams is because usually there's a lot on the line, usually the AFC North. But you can tell, this is just a rivalry that runs deep. So those games, you wish you could watch almost every week.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a respect there as well, which is something that really makes one of those rivalries work. I think you either have to have 2 teams that really can't stand each other and don't respect each other at all, or 2 teams that really respect each other and want to come out as the best. So we have my daughter used to have a classmate whose dad is a Steelers fan, so we would go over there, and whenever I go over there, I take over Ravens flags for the kids which they torment him with for a few weeks until the flags mysteriously disappear.
I remember I went to Pittsburgh, I think it was in 2012 when they were playing the Ravens. And I think the week before, Roethlisberger had gotten hurt, so it was Byron Leftwich.
Mm-hmm.
And the game was still close down to the very wire. I think Baltimore ended up winning 13-10. But you just knew from the very beginning that it was going to be, no matter who was in the game, it was going to be a hard contested fight. And it is true how there's a lot of respect between Baltimore and Pittsburgh, because I think when you're talking about teams that just want to go out and hurt each other, you'll think of the Steelers and the Bengals, let's say. But yeah, when you play Baltimore, there's a lot of respect there, so it's definitely a great rivalry, and both teams now look like they're gonna get some hot streaks going, so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out down the road.
I think it will be, and they're both well-run organizations, which I think makes a difference. It's hard to stay competitive in the NFL for as long as they have. You've had so many teams over the last 20 years or so who have a couple of seasons of being really good and then just fall away again. But throughout that, the Ravens and the Ravens and the Steelers have managed to stay competitive in a way that an organization like the Bengals just doesn't. I feel sorry for Bengals fans because they do seem to have an ownership that really is kind of just happy to take the money that comes with the team. They don't seem to want to actually turn it around and compete. Maybe that's going to change if Burrow settles in, but we'll see.
Yeah, it'll definitely take a few years. They'll definitely need a little bit more offensive firepower for them. But it's interesting to see where the AFC North is headed, because you have some really great rushing attacks right now in the league, and then you've got a lot of young quarterbacks. What's going to happen with Pittsburgh after Ben remains to be seen. But as of right now, it's a very promising division.
Oh, it's a really tough division, and you look at some of the others around the league. The NFC East obviously is a mess this year, but the AFC North looks like it has three very strong teams and a team in the Bengals that are certainly on the rise. So it's going to be a really competitive division for a while, I think.
Now, who is your favorite player from the Ravens?
Ed Reed.
Ed Reed?
I think just the way that you really never knew what was going to happen when you were watching him, and I just love that ability, and that ability to read the game too. I don't know if you've seen that it was something that Belichick brought up in the NFL 100 stuff last year when they did the all-time team, and he pointed out that that great interception that Reed got against Peyton Manning, and I was there. I was at that game actually. And apparently Reed had been deliberately playing a particular coverage wrong for weeks leading up to this game. He'd been kind of running away from this pass route that he knew that Manning liked. And so in that game, you'll see as the play unfolds, Reed starts to run away from where the ball is going to go. And then without even looking at what Manning is doing, he turns around and sprints towards, I think it was Reggie Wayne, I can't remember, but turns around and sprints towards the wide receiver, just gets between him and the ball and picks it off. And there was that kind of ability to just instinctively know what to do. I just loved watching him.
Yeah, there's definitely players that really excel in that game within the game, because that's a play that you can't really draw up on paper unless you're really athletic enough to do it. A lot of instincts go with being great players. I mean, for me, watching Troy kind of have the freedom to kind of blitz wherever he wanted, wherever he wanted. I think it's a lot like Junior Seau was too. So you just have some players that just have, especially on defense, that have just great instincts for the ball.
Yeah, and they, when they're right time and time again, there's just kind of magic to being able to do that. And there was another great one where I think it was the record-setting interception return at the time, but he picked off the Jets in the end zone, and NFL Films has a great shot of it where they cut to, well, first of all, they're watching the Jets sideline, and the Jets coach at the time is saying, it spots that Ed Reed knows what the play is going to be. So I think it was a halfback pass, and he's saying, don't throw it, Ed Reed, don't throw it. And of course, the halfback throws it, Ed Reed picks it off, and they cut to the Ravens sideline, and Brian Billick is on the sideline going, no, Ed, because he doesn't want him to return it. You're like, 7 yards deep in the end zone, just take a knee. And of course, Ed Reed said later, his view is always these guys are offensive players. They can't tackle. I'm gonna run with the ball. I know they can't tackle me. So he starts to come out, and once he's got to about 20 yards out, they cut back to Billick again, and Billick has gone from no Ed to go Ed, go Ed. Watching him go down the field. So it's like a 107-yard interception return. But again, it's that ability to just do something that goes completely against the percentage play, against the most sensible thing is just take a knee, accept the touchback. Your offense has gotten the ball back. But he knew he could change the game and he could turn the game around, and he was just capable of doing that.
Now, who do you think was one of the more underappreciated Ravens since your time as a fan?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that certainly, well, I mean, Ravens fans have a degree of respect, but I don't think anyone realized quite what an important role Anquan Boldin was playing when he was there, to the extent that after the Super Bowl, the team traded him to the 49ers thinking they would be fine. And he was one of the big reasons why that team dropped off massively. He had become Flacco's safety blanket, essentially. Flacco knew that he could put the ball up there and Bolden was going to go up and get it and make something happen. But I suppose he's a guy who's kind of known as being a pretty big name. I think that one of the guys who I mean, he's still there, is Anthony Levine, who I think is a real unsung hero on the Ravens. He's one of my favorite Ravens because he's mostly on special teams and he's an absolute special teams genius. If you go back and watch the Week 1 Browns fake punt from early this season, that the Ravens forced a fumble when the kicker ran with it and they recovered the fumble. If you watch that before the play, it's Anthony Levine who spots right away that the fake is coming and starts calling it out to the defense before it's even been snapped. But he also, because Wink Martindale's defense is just crazy and people get inserted blitzing and doing all sorts of crazy stuff everywhere, he occasionally does get on as a sort of hybrid safety linebacker kind of guy. So Anthony Levine's a guy that I have a lot of time for.
And so do you follow in the UK any other professional league or minor league team aside from the NFL?
In American football, or
no, in the UK? Like, do you have any sort of professional league over there?
There's not a professional football league over here. There's obviously soccer is huge, but there are UK teams. I mean, it was actually probably bigger for UK football teams in the 80s when there was well over 100 teams. There were loads of teams playing in the 80s. And there's a lot of people who think that actually the World League, when the NFL launched the World League here, that took a lot of oxygen out of the UK game. But there are teams here that do play on an amateur level, but it's not something that I know a lot about.
And I'm assuming the same is with like college and high school. There's not a lot of teams going on there.
Not really. I mean, the kind of college sports thing isn't the same as it is in the States. So there was actually an American football team at my university, but it's pretty random as to whether universities have them or not. And there's not the same kind of organized college league sports thing here that there is in the US. So it's I mean, the NFL, because they are targeting the UK as a market, they do go into schools and teach kids American football, but it's what do you call it, tag football or flag football. So they're kind of going in and teaching them the flag game, but that seems to be done on a kind of, it's quite sporadic. I think it's more of a marketing exercise than a serious attempt to get the game going in schools. But there's a little bit of that happening. Gotcha.
Okay. Now, when it comes to Pigskin books, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to do this. Because obviously, to do a website like this, you must really love books and love to read. So can you kind of tell me what your thought process was when you were deciding to launch a website purely dedicated to football books?
Sure. So, yeah, as you say, I am a big reader, and I've loved books really ever since I was a kid. So I used to have a books blog, just a general books blog with a bunch of friends that was called 26 Books, and the aim was it was kind of a book club, but the only thing you had to do to join was commit to read 26 books in a year, which is one every 2 weeks, and then blog about your opinions of it. So we did that for a little while, but I've been into football books. As I say, as a kid, I would get some as a way of understanding the sport better. And then as I knew more, I would particularly look for books about the strategy of the sport and how that worked. But it's hard to find them here. Most bookshops here don't stock them. And even on Amazon, which tries its kind of, people who bought this also bought this thing. But that can be quite hit and miss with football books. So what I would do is, because my wife's from the States and her family are in Maryland, when we would go over there, I would find a couple of bookshops nearby and I would just go in and basically buy all the football books that looked good and take them back home with me. And so I eventually reached a point where I thought, I wonder if anybody's got a site that explains which books you should read and which ones are worth paying attention to. And I looked around for it, and nobody really had done it. Chris Wessling from the Around the NFL podcast has a spreadsheet of recommended books, and he's known as being a football books guru. But the spreadsheet really just links you through to Amazon. It doesn't tell you very much about them and what you're going to get. And so that's when I thought, actually, maybe I should just do it. I'll just kind of set it up myself, and it can be the kind of website I would have liked to have been around sort of 15 years ago when I was starting to build up a collection of books.
And what year was this that you launched the website?
So the website's been going 2 years now.
Okay. And when you were reading, the magazines growing up, did they ever have any sort of book review in there, or was it purely just about, what games were happening?
That was purely about the games that were happening. So football books, I don't think they were really getting published here, other than, like I say, the annual. So it would be, the American Football 1986, and it was just a review of the previous year. But very few of the football books were making it over here back then.
And do you remember the football book that you first read?
Well, there would have been those annuals. Would be ones that I read when I was a kid, and the Record and Fact books that I would get. And then I think after that, the first one, the one that kind of kicked off my current obsession, would be Michael McCambridge's America's Game, which came out, I think, in 2004.
Yep.
And so that was when I thought, I should read this because I really want to have a better understanding of the history. I feel like I've got a lot of gaps. So I read that, and there's a great bibliographic essay in the back of that, which kind of points you to more reading. And that kind of kicked this whole current obsession off.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, before we get into talking about some of our favorite football books, is there a rare gem that you're still trying to find that you haven't been able to get your hands on? And if so, what is it?
Oh, that's a good question. There is actually a rare gem that I have got my hands on that I'm still trying to find for other people, because other people keep getting in touch with me. There's a book called Sleepers, Busts, and Franchise Makers, which came out in the early 80s and is about it's about the NFL draft. And the copy I've got, which will probably fall apart if I try and open it again, it's in really, really bad shape. But it's the only one that I've ever seen for sale. I mean, there aren't that many football books these days that are hard to find, because the internet has made it possible to order a book from anywhere on the planet. So it's quite easy to track down most things. But this is the only book that I've ever seen on sale. It's the only one of those I've ever seen on sale. And I've had 2 or 3 people contact me through the site to say, do you know where I can find this book? Including one guy who works for the Ravens, actually, and got in touch with me saying he had contacted the author, who doesn't have a copy. He'd asked around us some former GMs and stuff, and they don't have copies. So that one's incredibly hard to find, and I was just lucky to get it when I did. But I'm still actually looking for others. And there's one from a similar era one by a guy called Kevin Lamb, which is Quarterbacks, Nickelbacks, and Other Loose Change, which is apparently kind of an early take on the strategy book. So it's really something that Paul Zimmerman kind of kicked off that whole trend with The Thinking Man's Guide to Pro Football. But actually, until the kind of late 80s, early 90s, there weren't loads of strategy books. And so from what I can gather, this one is one of the early ones, which I'm looking to find a copy of, but haven't yet.
Wonderful. Okay, so I have a list of categories that I took down from your website, and I was thinking we could go through and talk about some of our favorite books within those genres.
Great.
So I figured we could go. Let's start off with the granddaddy of them all. Can you tell me what your favorite football book is of all time?
Oh, it's so hard to pick just one. I was thinking about this because I was thinking it's a question that you would probably ask, and I was trying to think which is the one that I could keep returning to. I think one that because I like the strategy stuff so much. It is impossible to pick just one, but I think I would say Ron Jaworski's The Games That Changed the Game. Because not only do I love the analysis of the strategy of that, it was one of those books that I've read that made me immediately want to go and seek out the film of the game to see the things that they were describing, because they did such a great job of bringing it to life and putting you on the field. So it's impossible to pick one, but I guess I would go for that one.
I was a big fan of that book too. I read it a few years ago, so I'd have to read it again. But I remember reading it, and I remember Jaws was talking about the Patriots' game plan against the St. Louis Rams in Super Bowl 36, I think it was. And I think that's probably a Super Bowl that I've seen probably more than any other, just because it's fascinating to see how Belichick had so many different personnel groupings and so many different formations, and really just was able to neutralize such a high-powered offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And his ability as a coach is extraordinary, and he's got so few. There are so few people like him in that ability to just completely rethink how they're going to present their team for a game. And I find stories about Belichick I always find fascinating, but that game plan particularly, and then obviously the classic one for the Giants versus the Bills, which gets mentioned in lots of books. But Belichick's ability to kind of come up with something that's gonna completely baffle the opposition is always fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. So the book that I went with for this category was The League by David Harris.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah, this was a book. I don't remember how I came across it, but somehow I found it online and I ordered it, I think in 2018. And that was the book that really got me interested in football as a narrative. I was always interested into the strategic part of the game and, reading books that coaches had written and some player biographies. But this kind of opened up a whole universe within football that I knew existed, but I didn't know how in-depth it went. And the way that Harris was able to take all this information about the owners and put it into a 600-page book, and not only put it in there, but also make it relevant to the greater central theme about the deterioration of like the boardroom battles and the legal disputes and whatnot. I thought it was really masterfully done. And it's definitely one of the most ambitious books that I've ever read, period. And it's certainly my favorite football book, but I would definitely say it's one of my favorite books in general. It really just gave me so much to think about it as far as football goes, more than just a game, but actually as an institution in American culture.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an absolutely meticulously researched book, and the amount of stuff that he had to go through to kind of dig up all of the little insights into how the teams are run. And I think it's something that I find really interesting as a theme. It's certainly, as I say, strategy stuff is my favorite stuff. But I think beyond that, I'm really interested in the whole idea of the NFL as a business and that kind of tension between business and sport and culture more widely. So Harris's book is essential reading for that. I think Brand NFL by Michael Oriard is an important one for that as well. And just books. It's a similar thing like Mark Leibovich's Big Game. His is sort of slightly more. He plays for laughs quite a lot rather than sort of digging into the research. But any of that stuff that says, what's going on here is big business as well as a cultural touchstone and a sporting touchstone. And very often the people making the money out of the business side will kind of use the sports side and the cultural side as a distraction. And I think Harris digs into that really in a really interesting way.
Yeah, the way he's able to show how a group of men really turned a sport into an industry, I think was really fascinating to read. And I think in many ways it's kind of a book about a tragedy in a sense, because obviously Pete Rozelle, I think most people would acknowledge as the greatest commissioner, and they're certainly in football, but definitely one of the greatest in all of sports. But this is almost a book in a way that feels like it's a challenge to his legacy. It kind of makes it seem as if he was great, but I think in the end his mission kind of deteriorated, and not necessarily all because of his fault, but there were just challenges that he wasn't able to overcome, and it kind of detracts from him in a certain regard. It seems is what Harris is getting at.
Yeah, I think there is some truth in that. I think that especially the stuff around his battles with Al Davis and wanting to move franchises. There had been, I guess, this phase where the sport had kind of got onto a stable footing and started to grow throughout the 50s, and it was kind of anchored by guys like Hallis, who were, who always kind of put the overall product above any individual team's needs. And it's, this is about the sport and it's about the league, and that's bigger than any of us. And I think there was a kind of change of generations of owners through the 70s and into the 80s, and that caused a tension for Rozelle. And as you say, he wasn't always able to meet those challenges, which I never think it kind of makes sense. I think if you look at people who are, whether they're managers or senior politicians or corporate leaders or whatever it is, most people have a kind of time, and there comes a point where actually, for whatever reason, circumstances just get beyond them, and they're no longer able to meet every challenge, whether it's because the era has changed or because their skills are no longer sufficient or whatever it is. I mean, Rozelle's kind of denial of the drugs problem within the NFL was initially based on the idea of, if we bring in testing and we start talking about the problem, then that makes people think make people think it's worse than it is. So his reaction to it was as a PR man, which is obviously his background.
Yeah.
And that may have been a sensible response if it had just been something that would blow over and disappear, but it didn't. It became worse. And it got to a point where you had some teams that had big drugs problems off the field with, particularly players taking cocaine, but then you had the steroids problem and performance enhancing drugs on the field. And eventually Rozelle had to give in and kind of acknowledge, okay, we are going to test players. We are going to make this something that is part of fair play and how we uphold the fairness of the league. And that's an example of an area where I think his instincts stopped him from reacting as quickly as he should have. And it's easy to look back at this era where most sports have got to grips with performance enhancing drugs. It's easy to look back at this era and say, yes, that's what he should have done. But it's an example of where he was kind of out of step with where things were going, I think.
Yeah, and I think his commissionership was just shy of 30 years. So obviously there's going to be some things that are going to be looked upon and say, hey, you should have done this and that. But ultimately, I think he's the guy that kind of transformed the sport from being kind of a Rust Belt game and really turned it into something that's really captivated, American life in many ways. So yeah, it's definitely a book I think that does it justice. And I also think it does raise some interesting counter arguments too.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing. I think it's very easy for a lot of books to simply focus on the glory side of the game and kind of tell you how great everybody involved was and what a good job they did. And there's a place for doing that. But I think there is also a place for journalists coming in and actually analyzing the decisions and why they were made. And, I think Rozelle's legacy stands. Everything he achieved was extraordinary, but you don't have to think of him as perfect. You can look at, okay, well, this is an area where circumstances got away from him, or he was out of step with the changing times or whatever. And I think that provides you with a richer picture what was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book I think was released in 1986, and a lot of people will say it doesn't hold up as well because the full title of the book is The League: The Rise and Decline of the NFL. But
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people, because I'm 25 years old, so I think a lot of people my age look at a title like that and think, "What are you talking about? The NFL has never been stronger." But that wasn't the case in the mid 80s. There was a lot of doubt as to whether the NFL was going to keep up its success. There was a lot of fan bases that had just kind of grown weary of the constant legal battles and just the sort of media circus that had surrounded the negative aspects of the sport.
Yeah, and I think that's what's fascinating about that. And it's part of what fascinates me about reading old books in general is that you're kind of reading the stance that people had at the time. And obviously, things that they don't because you know how the history played out. The one I mentioned earlier, the Sleepers, Busts, and Franchise Makers, it ends with them discussing whether the draft will survive as a thing because they were writing at a time when there had been a series of court challenges by players and the courts had actually ruled, yeah, the draft is basically unfair. It's kind of anti-competitive. And so they were saying, well, it might not last much longer. It might be replaced by something completely different. And obviously we know now, almost 40 years after they were writing, that the draft is now one of the big sporting events of the year, despite no sport actually being played. It's bigger than it's ever been. But I think it's interesting to look back at those perspectives because they're always reminders that things don't have to turn out the way they have turned out. It's kind of there are these turning points in history where different things could have happened.
Definitely. Now, what are some of your favorite player bios?
Player bios is kind of one of my weak areas, I think. I probably read fewer of these than most people, partly because I think, every player who becomes a star at any stage pretty much has a book out at this point. And so a lot of them are kind of interchangeable. But I think my absolute favorite is Dave Megacy's Out of Their League, which is, it's still an astonishing piece of writing. So I can't imagine what it must have been like when it came out in 1972 or whatever, for a player to kind of say, there's a much darker side to the game of football that nobody has spoken about before, and to detail that the way he does. And his description of some of the brutality of the sport. I mean, there's an amazing description where he talks about trying to tackle Jim Brown, and he ends up looking out of the ear hole of his helmet because Jim Brown has hit him so hard. And it's just this extraordinary sense of what a violent game it is to play. But then also there's stuff that he gets in trouble for protesting during the national anthem. He gets accused of being anti-patriotic by fans and being accused of being a liberal because he's protesting against Vietnam. And so there's so much stuff where you think, wow, this is 50 years ago and it's exactly the same issues that are still going on in the game today. So I think that's an extraordinary book.
Yeah, and also when he's talking about playing college football too, when he talks about how, kind of the administrators and the athletic directors kind of organize it to where you can only really do certain majors because you had to practice, and the amount of, money that's being paid under the table. So like you said, it's really fascinating to see that a lot of the issues within football and on a broader cultural context that we have today were just as a lot as, 50 years ago as they are today.
Yeah, definitely. And that side of college football, particularly, again, it just that just kind of went under the surface for a long time. And it was maybe, again, sort of the 90s before people were really drawing attention to it in books. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, he was way ahead of his time in flagging that as well.
Yeah, because I'm reading Michael Oriard's King Football right now, and he says in the beginning that the title is taken from a book that was published in 1932 called King Football, and I don't remember the author of that, but that was essentially the same thing where he was writing about in the 1930s how colleges had kind of sacrificed academic standards and integrity for favor of, giving preferential treatment to players, and in some cases, taking advantage of the collegiate players. So it's, again, and that's a book that's 80 years ago or, 90 years ago. So it just shows that, maybe some issues will always persist.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, there's some of these themes that just come around time and again.
Yeah. And so the book I chose for this one, and like you, this isn't really my strong suit, but I went with They Call Me Assassin by Jack Tatum and Bill Kushner.
Ah, okay.
And this is I think it's a book that's interesting to read because I think a lot of people use the word, violent player a little too loosely, but, Jack, to me, when I watch him play, is a guy that really is a violent player. He's very physical. He's very in your face. He is someone that's going to leave his mark. And when he's writing the book, a lot of what he's writing today, obviously wouldn't fly in the game, but I also don't think, it's something that a person would necessarily admit willingly. He talks about how him and his teammates, particularly George Atkinson, had a contest throughout the season to see who they could knock out. Right. And they would have like a point system. So hearing that perspective and hearing just how candid he is about it just kind of gives you a glimpse into a physical time with one of the most physical teams in the Oakland Raiders. But also kind of going off the some things never change. He talks also about the brutality of the game, and he gives a couple suggestions to make it safer. And one of that was interesting, was getting rid of zone coverage, which is really fast. Yeah, and that's fascinating because as a free safety, you figure that's where your bread and butter is. Why would you want to get rid of it? But his line of thinking is like, listen, when you have man on man, I'm not going in for a tackle. I'm trying to keep up with them. And then he also suggests that defenses move to a 5-man defensive line. And he also talks about on kickoffs, putting it at the 40-yard line, which I think right now it's at the 35. So he was ahead of his time on that. But just being able to get a glimpse, into that time period from one of the most notorious players of that era, I think really is a good read. And his insights as to, where the game was headed kind of, foreshadows a lot of what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's not one I've read, actually. It's on my very long list of books that I want to get for my collection, but I haven't read it. And it's fascinating. Obviously, you could make it a rule of how many defensive players have to be on the line. I don't know how you would outlaw zone coverage. Actually, forcing defensive backs to play a particular coverage seems to be a hard thing to throw a flag on. But it's interesting, as you say, that this is an issue that at the time was much less discussed than it is now. And now with concussion being such a big deal, I think we will see more of those kinds of rule changes over the next few years to make the sport less violent.
Yeah, I think if you were going to outlaw zone coverage, I think you would have to be a little bit more liberal with the holding before the pass penalties. And because the only way I could see it is if you have like an illegal formation where you have a defensive back that's lined up more than say 5 or 6 yards off the ball.
That would. But
sense. It would be an interesting experiment to see. But I just think with the athleticism today of the offensive players, it would be a real challenge.
Oh, it absolutely would. Trying to cover the current Chiefs purely in man, for example, would be terrifying.
Yeah. Now, what about your favorite business books?
So this is an area that I do like quite a lot. Like I say, after the strategy books, I think this is maybe my next favorite area. And the one that really kind of opened this up for me was Brand NFL by Michael Oriard. So that's the one that's the one I would pick, I think. And particularly because it was the first deep dive I'd read into the labor negotiations, and it was the thing that started me thinking, oh yeah, actually, even though these players do mostly earn a lot of money, they are taking a lot of risks physically, and we should think about how they're rewarded, and we should think about what they get and what's fair. So I think Brand NFL by Michael Oriard would be my pick there.
And for mine, I went with the Gray Flannel Pigskin, Movers and Shakers in Pro Football.
Oh, wow, I don't even know that book, so that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a book by William Henry Paul, and I think it was published in 1974. And each chapter describes a front office personnel member across the NFL. And it really kind of gives you like a sort of day in the life of what they do. It gives you sort of the background, how they got into their position, and then talks about, some of the things that they have to do throughout their career, throughout their day, some anecdotes. Like they have Jack Horgan, who was the executive vice president of public relations for the Bills. And it talks about how he has to, communicate with fans and the players and everything. But, in particular, he talks a lot about how his job was kind of to maybe not part of his job, but something that he had a lot to do was kind of keep OJ calm during his first few years in Baltimore or in Buffalo rather. And he
Right.
was saying that, the first few years that OJ was in Buffalo, the offense wasn't really built around him. They were trying to get him to block and catch the ball out of the flat, and he was getting frustrated and he wanted to leave. And Jack was kind of the one that calmed him down and kept him kept him level-headed, and eventually turned out well in the end. And then, for the Chiefs, there was a GM named Jack Steedman, who was actually an accountant for Lamar Hunt's oil company, and then he came over to run the team as a GM whenever they won their Super Bowl in the early 70s.
Right. Okay.
So it's a good book that analyzes the front office culture of the NFL at a time when the front office was only about 15 people. And he also mentions, he doesn't have his own chapter, but he mentions a guy named Dick Gordon, who was actually an astronaut that became the executive vice president for the Saints. So,
oh wow, that sounds fascinating. I definitely need to get a copy of that. And Jack Horrigan is great. He's one of the authors of The Other League, which is a really really good book about the AFL. And obviously Jack's son Joe was at the NFL, the Pro Football Hall of Fame for a long time, and wrote a really good history of the league last year.
Now, going on to football history, this is kind of the most open-ended category. But if you had to, pick some books within football history, whatever angle you want to take, what would they be?
Well, I think you kind of have to pick America's Game, which I don't mean that to sound as grudging as it does. I mean, it's just the definitive football history book, I think. So I think you can't talk about this as a category of books without America's Game. I mean, it's, not only is it meticulously researched and there's so much depth and detail in there, but also Michael McCambridge is such a fantastic writer and manages to bring this stuff to life and really take you inside a lot of these rooms, or puts you on the sideline during a game or whatever. And it's something that it's a subject that can easily be quite dry. And I find there's a lot of people working today who write quite important history books. They'll go back and look at a forgotten team from the 60s or something and research everything about it and put the book out. But they can be quite dry to read. You can feel like you're sort of having to work your way through sort of years and years of stats from how this guy did on the pass, or how they changed their running game, or whatever it is. And that's not the case with America's Game at all. I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating to read, and just really comes to life.
Yeah, it's very fluid throughout, and the way that has such a vast history, because earlier when we were talking about the league, it's a book that probably spans a couple of decades, but this really goes into a much deeper, or into a much broader context of football, in terms of seeing it from the players' angle, from the angle of the owners, the AFL owners, NFL films. So the way that he's able to take these multiple vantage points and kind of create this coherent idea of how football had kind of surpassed baseball and surpassed college football for that matter too, into becoming something really into the hearts and minds of Americans that just really grew passionate about the sport.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then for this book, I went more with the evolution of football itself, and I went with Anatomy of a Game by David M. Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a book that I find really fascinating, because there's only I think a handful of books that really chronicle the sport year by year, and how the rule evolution kind of also complemented made possible the evolution of strategy. And this was published in 1991, so you can most certainly do a continuation of this book. And then also there's a few other ones, like Park H. Davis has the Football, the Intercollegiate Game, which is a very detailed dissection of football from the 1880s up until about the 1910s, maybe the 1920s. Mm-hmm. But this book, I think, is very all-encompassing in talking about how the line of scrimmage laws were formed, about the forward pass, about ineligible players downfield, about the decline of the kicking game, which was much prevalent in the 1880s up until the first decade of the 1900s. So I think it's definitely a book that kind of stands on its own as an official history of the rule evolution.
Yeah, and I think that is an important aspect of the history of the NFL. I mean, as a British fan, soccer is notoriously resistant to rule changes. So there's been we have video replays now, which were resisted for years and years and years and years. And fans, by and large, hate them, absolutely hate them. Any kind of change to the way soccer has always been played is resisted passionately by soccer fans. But the NFL has grown to the state as it has by seeing what they're doing essentially as providing, it's an entertainment product as much as anything else. And so we have to ensure that it stays entertaining and exciting, and people get the best opportunity to show off these incredible talents. And so the game that we have now is radically different even from the game of the 80s, really. And I'm sure that in 20 or 30 years time, the game will look significantly different again, and there'll be other rule changes.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see because I spent a lot of time on YouTube watching old games from, as early as the early 70s up until, the early 2000s, and just to see the kind of the progression of how offenses and defenses have kind of reacted to one another. You look at the split back formation that was used predominantly in the 70s and throughout the 80s, and kind of how multiple tight ends and I formation came in to the run and shoot and spreading the ball out to now having pistol offense, read options, RPOs. It's something that is really great on football's behalf, that it's been able to kind of evolve the game with its audience throughout the years.
Yeah, and that back and forth is also an important part of the story, because it is this, as you say, constantly the offense will come up with an innovation and the defense will find a way to stop it, and so on, backwards and forwards. And that's always been the thing that's really made me fascinated by the sport, I think.
Absolutely. Now, what about the embedded journalist trope?
So this is an interesting one, because it is quite hard to overlook Paper Lion, which obviously is George Plimpton kind of defined this as an entire concept, and that's a brilliantly written book, and it's got so many great scenes in it. But I think actually, in terms of a favorite, Collision Low Crosses by Nicholas Davidoff is one that I just really, really enjoyed. And I found that I'm not particularly interested in the Jets at all, but I found myself absolutely riveted by what was going on with that team. And he was able to, because of the way things had changed. I mean, obviously, Plimpton was getting in the game, and he was on the field during training camp. And there's a difference in the way that reporters are handled in a much more professional organization. But Davidoff still gets very close to all these people, and particularly to a lot of the coaches, and explains to you their thinking and why they're doing what they're doing, and also that sense of the constant slog that they're on to digest film and come up with a plan for the next week. And then suddenly, as he thought he was, as so many of these writers have done, he thought he was going into a team that was going to make a Super Bowl run, and that doesn't happen at all. Suddenly it's over. That's it, gone. And so I really, really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, and it seems those kind of books are better whenever the team fails in a certain way.
I think so. I think that does bring something to it that you don't otherwise get. And I think it's interesting that the majority of them that you look at, 3 Bricks Shy of a Load, Next Man Up by John Feinstein, Collision Low Crosses, the writer usually does think that they've picked a team that's got a shot at the Super Bowl. And so often it's not the case, because obviously only one team in the league is going to end up there. So the odds are it's not going to be the one that you're embedded with. But as you say, it brings this really interesting perspective to what it means to be part of a team. And I think that's something that Davidoff brings across really well, actually, because he talks about being a very unathletic kid when he was younger, and obviously being very bookish. And his time with the Jets makes him wish he'd been part of a team when he was younger. He suddenly sees the value of being part of a team, and that isn't diminished by the fact that this team ends up. I think they didn't even make the playoffs. They just kind of collapsed, basically.
Yeah, and speaking of the Jets, there were 2 books that I really that popped up in my head whenever I saw the category. And one of them, which you know very well, is Dr. Z's The Last Season of Weeb Ewbank.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is just such a fascinating book because Weeb is a coach that for the most part has been lost to history. You know, people will know him as the coach that upset, you know, the Baltimore Colts in Super Bowl III. But I don't think really a lot of people will know too much about him as a coach or as a person. And Dr. Z's book really just kind of takes you inside and really sees, you know, kind of Weeb's methods and how in certain regards it worked against him. You know, he was somebody who was very reliant on aging veterans and didn't want to give a lot of exposure to young rookies. You know, he had a stingy, kind of a notoriety as a stingy negotiator. And Zimmerman really does a good job of showing, you know, game by game how everything kind of worked against Weeb. And a lot of it was out of his control too. I mean, you know, the management for the Jets historically has prevented them from being really successful. And that's definitely on display in the book.
Yeah.
But I think I would probably give Three Bricks Shy of a Load a little bit of an edge over that one because I do like how Roy Blunt Jr. kind of approaches the team from an outsider's perspective. Because when you see Dr. Z or read his work, you know, you'll see this as a guy that knows football in and out. So he's not going to give you a lot of his own interpersonal beliefs about the game or, you know, his observations if it doesn't really have to do with the game itself. And with Three Bricks Shy of a Load, I really like how Blunt is kind of an outsider going in. You know, he talks a lot about the games, but he also focused more on the philosophy of the game and, you know, the philosophy of Pittsburgh as a city and kind of how the team interacts with the city and the atmosphere that kind of cultivates from them finally being a winning team. And he even has like he has a certain quote in there too that came, I think, from Ray Mansfield, where he says, you know, pro football is not an open society. It's a society at war. And the colorful language like that, I think, really contributes to the overall power of the book. And it's fun too because, you know, he also brings up, I'm not sure if you remember this in the book, where he talks about ways to make the game more fun, and he gives some recommendations about the center being eligible to catch a pass. And then he also talks about if you want to kick a field goal or an extra point, you have to have one scrimmage play, I think, on each drive.
Yeah, I think you can't really go wrong with that book. It's a classic football book, not just a classic of the embedded journalist genre. So, yeah, you certainly can't go wrong with that. And the last season of Weeb Ewbank, as you say, is another classic. And I think what Paul Zimmerman's so good about there is picking at the humanity of Weeb Ewbank that doesn't always come across when people are writing about football, but. You know, he was the only head coach to win an NFL title, an AFL title, and a Super Bowl. You know, literally nobody else did that. And as you say, he's been kind of forgotten by history. But I think that book is a good memorial to him. It does really do him justice as one of the sport's greats. And Zimmerman isn't afraid to show his mean side or show him as being slightly ridiculous sometimes. It's a really human portrait, I think. Whereas the interesting thing about Three Bricks Shy of a Load is that that's a book where the coach is almost entirely absent. He's just there's very little presence of Chuck Noll there, which makes it interesting among that genre because very often the embedded journalist genre is kind of the coach is the sort of all-seeing mastermind of everything. But in Three Bricks Shy of a Load, I mean, Chuck Noll is sort of mentioned in passing a couple of times, but you don't really think of him as a character in that book.
Yeah, and it's interesting how most of the characters in that book or most of the players in that book are linemen, typically. Like I know Ernie Holmes is pretty prevalent throughout the book, Dwight White. So you don't get like a lot of the and Bradshaw's mentioned here and there too, but you don't really get like a lot of the star power that you think about when you think of the 70s Steelers.
Yeah, and it fits in with what Paul Zimmerman always said, which is that if you need quotes on a football game, it's always the linemen that you go to because they're the more cerebral, more expressive ones.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, when you're talking about humanity, especially with Weeb Ewbank, I immediately think of the end of that book whenever they're in Weeb's garage and he's going through his old memorabilia. You know, he goes through a lot of his pictures from when he was playing football, his old Letterman's jacket. He even pulls out a short story that he wrote about a Purdue fullback whose name I can't remember. But it just goes to show that, when you see a coach on the sideline and when you see a player on the sideline too, there's so much more behind what you see on television. There's a whole life there and a whole life within football. And it just really makes you wonder about the football journey that they went through to get to where they are now.
Yeah. I think I agree with you completely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that strategy was your favorite, and I know you already mentioned Ron Jaworski's book. So what are some other strategy books that you really take to?
So I do. I really like The Pro Style by Tom Bennett, which is it's kind of an early attempt to explain strategy to casual fans, and it's a surprisingly deep book, particularly because in one of the appendices is a graphical guide, a sort of I can't remember exactly what they call it. It's the sort of the graphical or a drawing guide to football, and they go through with these illustrations that essentially just show you how the formations have changed over time and how that really illustrates strategy in a very simple way that requires far fewer words than most books. He also has this amazing line about how no teams own a computer because they're too expensive, which I think is just one of those amazing things where you look at how much things have changed in such little time. Blood, Sweat and Chalk by Tim Layden is a really interesting one where he kind of goes at the play level. So I see there as being sort of, when people want to know what to read from a strategy book's point of view, there's kind of three books that kind of take three levels of the game. So you've got Blood, Sweat and Chalk, which is at a play level. He looks at individual plays and how they work and how they've been developed. Then you have the Games That Change the Game, which looks at games level, so how a particular strategy was employed and how it worked. And then Doug Farrar's Genius of Desperation, which looks at the sort of much broader how strategy has changed over history and how certain things go in and out of fashion, and how different people have kind of influenced the way things go. And I think Doug Farrar's book is interesting because it kind of makes clear that, like I was saying earlier, like just how many of these historical moments turn on little events. So the 49ers of the 50s were using a shotgun formation, but it was completely unsuccessful. And so it was just sort of buried for years. It was kind of forgotten about until somebody, I think it was maybe Tom Landry with the Cowboys, came back to it and started to win with it. And then other people go, okay, maybe that's an interesting idea. And I think Doug really brings that point to life, this idea that there are certain things that just take off for reasons that you can't quite pinpoint. And very often it's just because somebody tried something and it worked, so other people imitate it. And those three books kind of make that clear, but as I say, at different levels of the game, whether you're looking at the play or the game plan or the overall kind of team strategy that stretches over a season.
Yeah, and I think too, you see how some things will go out of style at one point and they won't work in a certain era, but then, as you mentioned with like Tom Landry, it comes back and works with great success. I mean, I think with the 49ers in the 50s, I think they were also using like a 3-quarterback rotation. And it's a strange approach, and I don't think that's anything that will ever be replicated in today's game. But it does make you marvel at how a lot of coaches back in the early days, from the 1920s to the 1950s, were experimenting with a lot of formations and play types that you can see are kind of reappearing in today's game in some variation or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are coaches who are specifically looking for that kind of stuff. I think Bill Belichick certainly knows his football history very well and is able to go back and find certain concepts. And what the Baltimore Ravens are doing with Lamar today echoes a lot of concepts from the 30s through to the 50s, and kind of playing around with ideas like the single wing and so on. And obviously those ideas are adapted for modern football, but they're not that different. They would be recognizable to coaches of the time, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and for this book, to me, Thinking Man's Guide to Pro Football is really what stands out by Dr. Z, to continue that trend. And the way he's able to break down individual positions, even going along the offensive line, talking about the difference between the center from the left guard to the right guard. He really gives you the full breakdown, and it's a great introduction. And a guy like him is always good to have because he always whatever you may think you know about football, he comes in and tells you that you don't know as much as you know. And one thing that I don't remember what chapter it was, but I remember there was one part of the book when he was talking about the Packers offense under Lombardi and how he said it's not as simple as you think, because especially in the passing game, a lot of those receivers have freedom to change the routes on the fly. They run option routes. So Bart Starr has to read the pre-snap defense and then the post-snap, and then also read how his receivers are adjusting to it. So I thought that was really interesting about how he kind of takes popular conceptions and kind of goes deeper and kind of either debunks or expands on it.
Yeah, I mean that is the book that really kicked off the whole idea of explaining strategy to ordinary fans, I think. And part of, because he was such a good writer, he was able to do it in a way that's engaging, but also it's frequently really funny, that book.
Yeah.
There's the amazing story of the Jets tackling dummy, which had all these various spring settings to it, and they turned it up to maximum and knocked somebody unconscious. It's just this sort of hilarious kind of slapstick idea of what NFL training must have been like. So he's got such a good ear for a funny story, I think, and it's the same with the last season of Weeb Ewbank as well. He's just his humor makes the stuff so readable.
Yeah, and all the funny stuff always has to happen with the Jets.
Yeah, it does seem to be the case. Yeah.
Now, what about football and society?
It's an interesting one because it is one of those areas where there's a lot of stuff. It can go in a lot of different directions, I guess. I think the book I would pick is one called Scoreboard Baby by Ken Armstrong and Nick Perry, which is about the Washington Huskies in 2000 and a series of scandals that they were involved in. So a couple of players were accused of sexual assault. Another guy was involved in a robbery. But what's more important than the actual details of the cases is the way that they uncover all of the corruption that was going on throughout the local society because the team was considered so important. So there's a guy who I forget what he'd done, but he ends up in court and the judge gives him a sentence to be served after the football season. So, even the judge is saying we don't want to mess with the team. That's the important thing. And it's a book that also talks about some of the ridiculous courses that the players were being put on to give the impression that they were actually learning something, when in fact they were there purely to play football. So there are certain, I think Mandarin is one of the courses where the tutor of the course is just passing everybody, just waving everybody through. So all the football players take it. There's a big waiting list to take it. So they uncover tons of stuff about the corruption in this team particularly, but also in college football more generally. And for me, as a former journalist myself, it's an absolutely astonishing work of reporting. Like the amount of detail. Almost all of this stuff is pulled out of court records and various statements that they had to dredge through to assemble the story. So it's I really admired it as a piece of writing as well. So it's got some of the stuff that these players are accused of is horrifying, and is the sort of thing that is still unfortunately plaguing a lot of sports and teams today. But it's an absolutely extraordinary book.
I've never heard of it, but I got to add it to my list. It actually sounds like another book that's on my list too, called We Won This Game. Have you ever heard of that one?
No, I don't know that one.
Apparently, that's about a journalist who followed a youth football team in Miami for a season and basically talked about kind of the corruption, the culture that surrounds that.
Right.
Which is, really interesting because obviously, it's a touchy subject, especially when you're talking about kids. But then when you get into like the nitty gritty and you see how much of a business youth football is down there, that to me kind of sounds like in a similar vein of the book you're talking about. So I'll have to check those out.
Yeah. And that's something. There's a book called Not for Long by Dr. Robert Turner, who he played in the NFL and the CFL, and he also played in the USFL as well, I think. But he's now a sociology professor. And he's written a fantastic book that's sort of ostensibly about the short careers NFL players have and and what happens to them afterwards. But he also looks at this sort of industrialization of youth football and what the cost is for players of going through that. And again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I don't think there's not a contradiction between. I think you can be a fan of football and love football, but also admit that there is a negative side to it, and that's something that we should try and understand and learn about as much as we can, and also do something about where it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book I chose for this one is called Touchdown: An American Obsession. And it's a collection of essays that are published by professors. And it kind of looks at football from a multitude of standpoints at a cultural level. So it talks about, the history of youth football. It talks about football in foreign countries and how it was developed, what the relationship is like today with, the NFL or even the NCAA. It talks about the TV networks and the role that media plays in cultivating the image of football. So it provides a lot of great viewpoints that you don't necessarily hear a lot about in reading or, in watching documentaries or anything like that. It gives a lot of different standpoints and a lot of good history that isn't really told. So that one is something I would definitely check out.
Oh, that's interesting, because I actually added it to my wish list pretty recently, because the book that I've most recently reviewed is by a guy who's a professor in a University of Central Florida called Richard Crepo, and NFL Football is the book that it's just been updated for 2020. But in going through that and looking at his bibliography, I came across Touchdown, which I hadn't heard before. And so I just added it to my list a few days ago. So I'm glad to hear that's an interesting one. I'll check that out.
Yeah, definitely. And so the last category I have, I don't think I saw it on the website, but I'm interested. What is your favorite football fiction book?
That's a good question. Yeah, it isn't on the website really, because I've done it as a top 5. I did a top 5 football fiction. But it was one of those areas where I'm kind of aware that football fiction books exist, but I haven't really read tons of them. And I think, the ones I listed on the list were things like A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley, which is commonly listed as a classic, North Dallas 40, Everybody's All-American, books like that. I think if I was picking a personal favorite, it's one that I put on that top 5, which is called Lost Empress by Sergio de la Pava. And it's a book that's kind of split. So Sergio de la Pava is a former attorney, and he's very interested in the unfairness in the criminal justice system. So kind of half of the book is to do with criminal justice and these characters who end up in prison, and they're loosely connected to these people who are trying to run an indoor football franchise. So there's this family. The woman in the book is the daughter of the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and he dies, and her brother inherits the Cowboys, even though he doesn't know anything about football. And she's a football obsessive, and she inherits a team called the Patterson Pork, who are an indoor football franchise. And so she decides that she's going to get her revenge by making this indoor league bigger than the NFL. And the story is just very, very funny, because they come up with all of these ridiculous ideas to try and get attention for their league. So one of them is that before the game, the mascots have a fight. So they stage a fight in the center of the field to see which mascot wins. They do all of these just ridiculous publicity stunts, basically. And it's just a very, very funny book. But there's a point partway through where he starts explaining why the 3-4 defense isn't very good. And it goes into this long depth about the 3-4 defense doesn't work because the only way you can do it is if you have a Hall of Famer at a key position. So the Steelers were able to do that. The Giants were able to do that. Most teams can't rely on having a Hall of Famer as the outside pass rusher. So you've got to go with a 4-3. And I was reading it and thinking, that's actually a really good argument. And it's not something I expected to find halfway through somebody's novel. But so that's an interesting book. That's the one I'd pick. And it's not one, I don't think it's a particularly well-known book.
Yeah, I've never heard of it, but it sounds interesting. Do you think that it's a good book to be adapted for like a mini series or a movie?
I think it would be tough because it's so crazy. I don't know if you're familiar with David Foster Wallace, who wrote Infinite Jest and
Hmm.
um, things like that. It's in a similar vein to him, and it's a slightly surreal take on the real world. So it happens in our world, but in a slightly weird version of our world. Um, and for long periods, it's hard to figure out what on earth the plot is. But it does all come together, and then has just a completely bizarre ending. I don't know. It would be interesting, like in this era where you have Amazon and Netflix making quite niche stuff into long series. Um, it might be something somebody could adapt now, but it's certainly something, sort of before the streaming era when series had to have much wider mainstream appeal. I don't think this would have had a chance because it's slightly too weird, but actually it might work as a sort of strange Amazon miniseries.
Yeah, I think some books like that are definitely better left as just books because oftentimes you see the adaptation just doesn't do it justice.
No, and it would be kind of hard to see. I mean, it would be kind of interesting to see this indoor football put onto the screen, but as I say, some of the ideas are so surreal. I don't quite know how they would actually do it.
Yeah, and indoor football, it's actually weird because it's a world that hasn't been explored too heavily in film and television, or even really in books that much. I mean, even six-man football has, I think, more screen time with Ryan Gosling's The Slaughter Rule.
Yes, yeah, I think you're probably right.
So for this one, I'm like you. I don't really have too many fiction books that come to mind for football. I know A Fan's Note is often labeled as the best football fiction book, but I haven't read that either. But
Mm.
one I actually read recently was called Only a Game by Robert Daly.
Hmm.
And Daly was actually a former public relations man for the New York Giants back in the 50s when they had Charlie Connerly and Frank Gifford. So he writes about this aging halfback for a fictional NFL team. So it takes place within the NFL universe, but they're just an anonymous team. Well, they're called the Big Red, but I don't think it specifies which town they're based in.
Right.
And he's in this very unhappy marriage, and he meets this commercial model that's working for I think Pepsi, doing promotions with the team. And they start an affair, and then basically you find out throughout the book, kind of how he felt in many ways life has passed him by because he was always concerned about being the all-American that everybody wanted him to be. Even going from marrying a woman that he didn't really love to being pressured by the owner to live a clean-cut life. So it's a really good story. It's almost like a Mad Men story, kind of set in the world of professional football in the 1960s. So I think that's a book that it's not very well known today, but I do think it does provide some interesting content for anybody that's interested in fiction and those kind of stories within the football universe.
I've heard of this book, but I haven't read it, or I don't own a copy. But I know of it because it was in Sports Illustrated's top 100 sports books, and that's the first time I came across it. So it is stuck on, as I say, this very long wish list that I have. It's on that list, but I've never read it.
Yeah, that's the list always keeps growing, right? When it comes to
Yeah.
books, it just never ends.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know when I will ever get to the bottom of it, but still.
Great. Now, but before I let you go, I just have one more question, and that is, if you were to write a football book, what would it be about?
So there's a few ideas that I've had that I thought would be quite interesting. I'd kind of like to read a book about cheating in football, because I think that there's some interesting stories to be told there, particularly things like how Buddy Ryan would often sneak a 12th man onto the field in certain points in the game, for example, and had figured out ways to kind of get away with it so it wasn't noticed. I think a book about cheating would be a really interesting one. And I'm also curious about the process of I think this would be a book that's so niche it would probably be of interest to me and a handful of other people, but the process of how a game is actually run by the coaches in the NFL, that I find the idea of how a play caller works really interesting, how these guys are all working together during the game as it unfolds. I mean, we talked earlier about how there are these pauses in the action, and it can seem, if you don't know the sport, it can seem like they're quite long pauses, but they're not really. There isn't a lot of time between plays. And so I'm kind of fascinated as to how much is adjusted on the fly. And we hear stories of this coach will say, well, the analytics guy said it was worth going for this fourth down. And I find myself thinking, how are these conversations happening in 30 seconds between plays? Like, how is this all being communicated, and who is deciding, okay, if this play fails, my next play is going to be a pass, and that means I've got to get these guys ready to go in. And then I've got to watch what the defense is doing, and if they're doing this, then I'm going to do that. I think there's so much going on in such a small space of time. I would really like to read a book about how exactly all of these plates are kept spinning, basically.
Wonderful. I hope that comes to fruition. I mean, certainly I think it would be a niche topic, but I mean, like you said, for real football fans who are fascinated with that part of it, it would definitely be good. And I think even for people who kind of are casual fans would look at that and say, wow, I didn't realize how much of it actually went into like these like small little breaks in between plays.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it would take some digging around and research to find out whether the story is actually there. Maybe it's all. I mean, it's something I think that interests me particularly because I didn't grow up in the US. So I didn't play football at school. It wasn't played at college. I'm just not. I've never been on a sideline. I don't really know how any of this stuff works, and I think it fascinates me in particular. But I also think at some point somebody surely is going to write a book about football and cheating. I think football and cheating is an interesting thing also from a philosophical point of view. Like, is it okay? Is it bad? There's the common quote that we hear: if you're not cheating, you're not trying, which used to be a Raiders motto, apparently.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you cheat in an NFL game, you're not breaking the law, but you're not supposed to do it either. But everyone kind of everyone's line is somewhere slightly different as to what's acceptable, when you can bend a rule, when you can break a rule, and so on. And I find that a really interesting topic.
And so would this only analyze cheating from the team perspective, or were you trying to look at outside influences as well?
I think predominantly from a team perspective. I mean, I think there's some sort of the outside influence, and we know that if you go back in history, there's been points where gamblers particularly have tried to influence players to throw games, or players have been gambling on games themselves. But I think in the modern NFL, everyone is well paid enough that nobody needs to take a bribe to cheat. I mean, it's the sort of thing that I have a friend who works for a betting company who tells me that there's certain sports like golf and tennis particularly where there's enough players who don't make enough money that you can kind of pay them to cheat in certain areas. But I think the outside influence of cheating in the NFL is probably not that big. But I'm kind of interested in, particularly in the sort of premeditated cheating. Like I say, Buddy Ryan would deliberately send on a 12th player for certain plays. There's even recently with the Ravens, figured out that on a punt play, if you just hold everybody and run out, it's a loophole that's now being closed. But there's this interesting line between am I cheating or am I exploiting a loophole in the rules, and what's the actual difference? And you see something recently, like I can't remember which game it was, but there was a guy who twisted another player's foot at the bottom of the pile. Was it a Cowboys game recently? I can't remember what game it was, but and that annoyed a lot of people because it was a deliberate attempt to injure somebody. That seems like that's definitely over the line. Shouldn't try and injure somebody on purpose. But then we have the whole Saints scandal a few years ago.
Right.
I think there's lots to untangle. Of kind of there's the mechanics of it. There's cheating that goes on. If you have rules and it's possible to become rich and famous by doing a thing, then someone will always break the rules to try and get that fame and success. So there's the mechanics of it, but then there's also the morality of it. Like, what do we accept and what do we think is okay?
Yeah, well, and also too, going back to late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of coaches who thought that they were sending scouts to watch their practice. They were disguised as fans or reporters or anything like that. Like, I know George Allen was very paranoid about that to make sure that no one was spying on their practices. So that kind of goes into a a whole another aspect of it too, because it kind of also echoes the AFL NFL rivalry when you had Operation Babysit, where they had play.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's an amazing story about Lombardi. I can't remember where I read it, but Lombardi was apparently so paranoid about practices being spied on. At one point, he saw what he thought was like binocular reflections from a tall building that overlooked practice. So he sent one of his minions to go and investigate, which sounds incredibly paranoid. But he was right. It was somebody with binoculars spying on practice, which is just one of those things where you just think, wow, like what? What are the chances that you would spot somebody? The guy with the binoculars must have thought he'd found the perfect location. But no, Lombardi was eagle-eyed, spotting everybody.
Yeah, well, and it goes to show some of those men who were just, maybe a little overzealous and meticulous and even paranoid, just happen to be the geniuses that really keep the game going.
Yeah, exactly. And you can go back to the Belichick stuff about the apparently videoing team signals and how much of an advantage does that actually give you? He was asked by Robert Kraft, like what was the advantage in filming the signals, and Belichick apparently said maybe 1%, which sounds trivial, and Kraft apparently, Kraft's story is that he said to him, well, then you're an idiot. But of course we know that in elite sport it is all about those marginal gains. So maybe your 1% gain is what gets you the extra win.
Yeah, most certainly. Well, Shane, that's all I have for you today. I'm really happy you decided to join me today. And, I love your website. I think everybody should check it out. And I really wish you the best of luck with the website. And also, if you actually do go through with this book, I'll definitely be ordering that if you ever complete it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been really good fun to talk to you. And thanks for your kind words about the site.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too. Bye.